Independent journalist Matt Taibbi was, once upon a time, a man of the leftist press corps in good standing. He wrote the book Insane Clown President about Donald Trump. But then he started to question the Russian hoax. And then he became one of the journalists that Elon Musk went to for release of the Twitter files. And then he started going after big tech, and he relayed being targeted by the IRS, a home visit from the IRS the day after he testified before the House Republicans' Weaponization of Government Committee. How ironic. Yeah, so no longer a man of the left in good standing because independent thinking is not allowed. You must stick to the narrative. You must hate who we hate and love who we love. His podcast, most recent installment of his podcast, interesting discussion with non-traditional guests when it comes to talking about these political matters that afflict us. Novelist Walter Kern. You know Walter Kern? He wrote Up in the Air, among other books. The discussion was about sort of timely in talking about election interference, not specifically with respect to the Trump indictment as an instrument of election interference, the FBI and DOJ, but just information interference, and specifically, a la Taibbi's work on the Twitter files, specifically big tech's next level information interference coming in advance of 2024. If you thought it was bad before, just as if you thought the FBI's interference in elections was bad before, how do you like them now? Well, that's essentially the same thing that they're saying about big tech. You know, get ready for what's coming. Listen to the exchange between Matt Taibbi and Walter Kern.
If you go off your nut on Twitter as a Trump supporter and say, this is it, I've had it, I don't want to be a part of this country anymore, we need to find a new way, here comes a civil war, etc. Well, your demerits are piling up pretty fast. The knob turners are watching at every step as anger and disgust mount. And, you know, should any of this emerge as real conflict, you know, somebody pulls out a gun, there is a clash between Antifa and whoever, the Patriot Front, and then people weigh in on that or start to align themselves around, you know, incidents, we're going to have a mushroom cloud of anti-disinformation warfare. And I fully expect that's what we're looking at. I mean, I don't want to be alarmist, and I don't want to add to the tension around this incident, but pattern recognition and just past behavior tells me that we're entering a period in which the interference with our conversation, as our conversation grows especially intense due to things like this indictment, is going to reach record levels. In other words, we're not looking in the rearview mirror at a departing phenomena that we saw in the Twitter files somehow neutralized and are watching wash away.
No, that was the fetal larval stage of what we're, right?
Yeah, yes. It's the fetal larval, and every weapon system awaits its war. And the weapons system that is the anti-disinformation complex, and it's right to call it a weapon system because to a large extent it's been framed as a security and a national defense issue, its war is coming.
Big tech's war is coming. The larval stage. We've been in the larval stage to this point, Taibbi said. All right. We're on the precipice of Ingsoc, the way that those gentlemen make it sound. And I'm not necessarily disagreeing. And by the way, this is after elections with Zucker boxes and wired up Google searches. I mean, what's the research from Robert Epstein, the Harvard-trained psychologist, in terms of his projection on how many votes Google moved in 2016 and could move in 2024? In the millions through this disinformation security complex they're talking about. For more on this, please be joined by Eric Kaufmann, professor of politics at Birkbeck College, University of London, author of White Shift, Populism, Immigration, and the Future of White Majorities. Professor Kaufmann, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Good to be here, Dan.
You
As
wrote,
always.
Yeah, good to have you. You wrote recently about this to some extent too. You talked in a piece you wrote for City Journal about the narrowing boundaries of acceptable debate, the shutting down of important policy conversations, and so the policy drift leftward in big cities, for example, on crime and immigration, education. What's your reaction to what you heard Kern and Taibbi discussing?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a similar phenomenon to what I wrote about in the sense of trying to shut down debates with ad hominem charges of different, playing the man instead of the ball. I mean, the piece that I wrote is really about how there's a certain rhetorical sleight of hand that's used by those on the progressive left to shut down conversations. And so, for example, and it's something called the fallacy of composition. It's a logical fallacy, and whether deliberately or unconsciously, this is the game that's often played. So, for example, if I say something like, if I was to say to you, it's very hard to tear a phone book. It doesn't follow that it's hard to tear a page in a phone book. That's an example of this fallacy. Or if you meet a Nigerian, yes, Nigeria is a poor country. It doesn't mean that individual Nigerian is poor. But going from that,
all poodles are dogs, but not all dogs are poodles.
Yeah. And so if we then take a statement such as immigration should be controlled or reduced for the benefit of the country, the technique is usually to turn that to personalize that and say, oh, you don't like immigrants, you don't like this immigrant, you want to exclude or prevent this immigrant from flourishing. That's the kind of game that I'm talking about through this fallacy of composition, right? So you can like immigrants individually, but still think that collectively for the society it's better to have immigration controlled. Or you can say that we want to get the divorce rate down, doesn't mean we're anti a single mother. So it's again that sort of technique to say, oh, you think that we should discourage transgenderism, that means you want to hate and exclude transgender people. You see that move from something which would make sense for the health of the society collectively. Instead of having a rational debate about that, it turns into a personalized debate about whether you like an individual. And that's just sort of something I was pointing to as a sort of technique that is used repeatedly to shut down debate.
Right, like insurrectionists, like all Trump voters, this, and all conservatives that, and throwing around the isms and the phobias. This is what you reference, Cass Sunstein, of all people, Cass Sunstein, calls opprobrium entrepreneurs. That's what the left is.
Well, yeah, because they have an incentive really to weaponize this taboo, to make everything personal and about hurting or harming some poor individual. So if you want to talk about transgenderism, you want to exclude a transgender person just because you want to sort of reduce the number of people try to transition. Or, for example, if you want to reduce immigration, you must hate individual immigrants. So let's make it a conversation about excluding and discriminating against an individual rather than talking about a policy of what's best for the country at a collective level. And so we see, and that's why if you talk about homelessness, for example, wanting to get people off the drugs or crime or any of these hot-button issues, they'll move instantly towards this idea that you are persecuting an individual, that you hate an individual in order to sort of make it a racist, a homophobic, etc. Type of statement, so that therefore the conversation ends. And what that means is then you get policy failure because you can't have a rational conversation about crime, homelessness, education, etc. And so policy just drifts in the direction of sort of untouchable progressivism, and I guess the question is we need to be unmasking that much more actively, because it's a sort of very much a sleight of hand. They're pulling the wool over our eyes with a pretty common logical fallacy.
Well, then how do we fight back or unmask, as you say?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we have to be able to spot that game, that switch from the phone book to the individual page in the phone book, that sort of game that's played. So whenever they try to play that game, we've got to sort of call them out on it and say, first of all, you're committing this fallacy, and you can be in favor of reducing immigration. It doesn't mean you dislike immigrants. It's a completely different category. So I think that's one way really to do it, is to just call it out, because I see them getting away with it, which is partly because we live in a more therapeutic society where people tend to be moved by images of individuals rather than by kind of arguments about collective properties. It's much harder. Another example is even talking about ethnic change and wanting ethnic change to slow down, and the idea there is, oh, you're a racist because you want to exclude and discriminate. No, that's actually, again, committing the same fallacy. But it means that we can't have that conversation, because whenever you want to have that conversation, it's fingered as being discriminatory, right? So I think it's just people getting familiar with this term, fallacy of composition, and just sort of bringing it up every time that there's that attempt to personalize what should be a collective and aggregate discussion about rationality.
He is Eric Kaufmann, professor of politics at Birkbeck College, University of London, author of White Shift, Populism, Immigration, and the Future of White Majorities. Professor Kaufmann, thanks as always. Appreciate it.
Thanks very much, Dan.
Thank you. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
It's